The early morning sun stretched long shadows across Nicholas Thompson's front yard as he made his way slowly down the concrete path. At 93, each step was deliberate and measured, his hands gripped around a wooden cane, not because he couldn't walk on his own, but because his daughter, Sarah, insisted he use it after a minor fall the previous winter. Nicholas had followed the same daily routine for years, ever since he moved into his suburban home in 1946. First came his private flag-raising ceremony, a tribute to the friends he lost in the Pacific during World War II. With steady hands, his weathered fingers grasped the rope, sending the stars and stripes into the morning sky. The neighbors, long accustomed to seeing the old veteran in his navy blue cardigan, crisp khaki pants, and polished brown shoes, were unaware that those shoes were carefully shined each Sunday evening while Nicholas sat in his favorite armchair, reflecting on the military discipline instilled in him nearly 8 decades ago. This particular Tuesday was no different, and as always, Nicholas had work waiting for him in his garden. His rose bushes, a source of constant care, needed attention. Though they always required his vigilance, it was that very need that gave him purpose, a reason to nurture and tend to something ever since the passing of his beloved wife, Martha, 5 years earlier. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called out Jenny, the 12-year-old girl from next door, riding her bicycle past his house. Nicholas smiled, waving at her, and recalling how she had helped him plant tulip bulbs the previous autumn. The neighborhood children, though he had no grandchildren of his own, often referred to him as Grandpa Nicholas. His daughter, Sarah, and her husband had never been able to have children, but Nicholas found a sense of family in his community. He made his way to the garden shed, retrieving his pruning shears and the worn gardening gloves Martha had given him on their 50th wedding anniversary. "Now you won't come inside with scratched hands," she joked back then. The gloves were patched in several places now, but Nicholas couldn't bring himself to part with them. As he worked in the garden, trimming and tending to his roses, his mind often drifted back to his Navy days. Just 19 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, he enlisted the very next day. The brutality of the Pacific theater was seared into his memory, but during quiet moments between battles on a small island, he had found solace in helping the local villagers tend to their gardens. It was there, knee-deep in rich soil beneath the tropical sun, that he learned how life could still thrive even in the shadow of war. That lesson had stayed with him all these years, guiding him in the years of peace that followed. The sound of a car horn broke his reverie, pulling him back to the present. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner house, honking twice as a special greeting before driving past with her grandkids on their way to school. Nicholas straightened slowly, feeling the ache in his back, and waved as the red minivan disappeared down the street. The morning continued peacefully as Nicholas tended to his roses, talking to them as he worked, sometimes sharing stories about Martha, sometimes catching up on neighborhood news. Some might think it strange for an old man to talk to flowers, but Nicholas knew better. Gardens, like people, needed care, attention, and conversation to thrive. At exactly 10:30 a.m., he went inside for his mid-morning coffee. Martha's old porcelain cups lined the kitchen shelf, and Nicholas always used her favorite, the one with tiny pink roses that matched their garden. He added 1 lump of sugar and a splash of milk, as he had done every day for the past 70 years. Settling into his worn leather armchair by the window, he had a clear view of his front yard. The flag fluttered gently in the breeze. His freshly pruned roses added vibrant red and pink hues to the landscape, and the morning sun bathed everything in a peaceful, golden light. This was his piece of heaven, earned through years of service, hard work, and dedication. Little did Nicholas know, this tranquil Tuesday morning would be one of the last peaceful ones he would experience. Soon, the roar of motorcycles would shatter his calm world, heralding the arrival of unwelcome visitors who would challenge his patience, courage, and resilience in ways he could never have anticipated. Nicholas Thompson had long since put aside the memories of battle, memories of a time when life had been more uncertain and dangerous. But for now he was content. Seated in his favorite chair, coffee in hand, he gazed peacefully out the window, watching the roses sway in the spring breeze. Little did he know the greatest challenge he would face since the end of World War II was about to begin. It was a calm Wednesday afternoon when the peace of his quiet neighborhood was broken. At first, it was nothing more than a distant rumble, thunder rolling in from far off. But the sound quickly grew, shaking the porcelain cups in Martha's old cabinet. Nicholas looked up from his newspaper, his rough, worn hands gripping the arms of his chair. 5 motorcycles roared past his house, engines growling in unison. It wasn't the first time motorcycles had passed down Ter Street, but something felt different this time. The bikes circled back, then pulled into the empty warehouse across the street. The building had been vacant for 2 years, ever since the furniture company moved out. Dusty boards covered its windows, and graffiti marred its once pristine walls. From his living room window, Nicholas watched as more bikes arrived. What started as 5 quickly swelled to 10, then 20, and eventually 30. The riders wore black leather vests emblazoned with a red snake symbol on the back. Their leader, a tall man with a shaved head and a thick beard, barked orders as they began breaking the chains on the warehouse doors. Mrs. Chen, from 2 houses down, hurried past, her little dog in tow, keeping her head down as the bikers whistled and yelled crude remarks. Nicholas frowned, remembering how different the day had been just hours ago, when Mrs. Chen had brought him some of her homemade dumplings. That evening, sleep eluded him. The raucous noise from the warehouse continued until 3 a.m., with the sound of music blasting through the walls and heated arguments erupting every few hours. Twice, Nicholas heard the shattering of glass. The next morning, he found Jenny's father, Mark, picking up beer cans and trash from his front yard. "Morning, Nicholas," Mark said wearily. "Did you get any sleep?" Nicholas asked. "Not much," Mark replied. "Called the cops 3 times. They said they can't do anything unless the bikers break the law." Mark glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Listen, maybe don't make a fuss today," he suggested. "These guys don't seem to care about much." But Nicholas wouldn't be swayed. He had faced bigger threats before in the Pacific, and he wasn't about to let a few bikers run him out of his own neighborhood. At exactly 7 a.m., he went outside as usual and hoisted his flag onto the rope. As he did, a motorcycle engine roared to life from across the street. "Hey, old-timer," a harsh voice called out. "Nice grass you've got there." The motorcycle revved loudly and then sped across Nicholas's meticulously maintained lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the soft earth. The rider, wearing a red snake vest, laughed as he made a circle and returned to the warehouse. Throughout the day, more bikers arrived. They called themselves the Red Serpents, and their presence brought an undeniable shift to the neighborhood. Children stopped playing outside, and Mrs. Rodriguez no longer honked her horn in greeting. Jenny's family kept their curtains tightly drawn. Nicholas watched as the bikers transformed the warehouse into their clubhouse, hanging their red snake banner above the entrance and setting up old, worn couches on the loading dock. The sound of breaking bottles and crude laughter became a constant background noise. That afternoon, as Nicholas worked to repair the tire tracks in his lawn, 3 bikers approached his fence. The leader, the tall man with the shaved head and a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, called out mockingly, well, boys, looks like Grandpa's playing in the dirt." "My name's Nicholas Thompson," Nicholas said, standing as straight as his aching back would allow. "Well, Nicholas Thompson," the man sneered, "I'm Snake, and this is our territory now. You'd better remember that." To punctuate his words, Snake spat on Nicholas's freshly cleaned sidewalk. His friends erupted into laughter, the sound carrying through the once peaceful street. That night, the noise from the warehouse was even louder than before. Nicholas sat in his darkened living room, watching the shadows move across his yard. He thought of Martha, thankful that she wasn't here to witness the decline of their beloved neighborhood. On the wall hung a photograph of him in his Navy uniform, taken in 1943. He had been young then, standing proud beside his shipmates, far from this quiet street, far from the chaos that had just begun. At 93, Nicholas Thompson could feel the familiar fire of determination rising within him once again. The bikers might think of him as nothing more than a frail old man, but Nicholas had survived battles far more intense than they could ever fathom. As midnight neared, and the sound of another bottle smashing against his fence echoed in the night. Nicholas made up his mind. Tomorrow he would act. He hadn't fought for his country just to let these bullies tear apart his community. But before he took any steps, he needed to ensure he wasn't alone in this fight. The weekend came, and with it, the loudest, rowdiest party yet at the Red Serpent's warehouse. The music blared, shaking Carol's windows well past midnight. Then 1 a.m., and then 2 a.m. Nicholas watched from his bedroom window as drunken bikers staggered down the street, knocking over trash cans and sending a stray cat, who used to nap on his porch, running for cover. By 2:30 a.m., he had reached his limit. He pulled on his navy blue cardigan over his pajamas, grabbed his cane, and slowly made his way outside. The cool night air hit him as the music grew louder with each step toward the warehouse. Empty beer cans crunched beneath his slippers. "Excuse me," Nicholas called out, his voice steady and commanding despite his age. It was the same tone he had used to instruct young sailors during the war. "It's past midnight, and our family is trying to sleep." The music lowered a fraction, and from the warehouse door emerged Snake, the biker leader. His snake tattoo seemed to slither in the dim light as he walked toward Nicholas, followed by 5 other bikers who circled him, blocking his way. Snake smirked as he eyed the old man. "Well, if it isn't Grandpa Garden," he sneered, taking a long swig from his beer bottle. "Past your bedtime, isn't it?" Nicholas stood firm, gripping his cane tightly. "My name is Nicholas Thompson, and I'm asking you politely to turn down the music. People need to sleep, and children have school tomorrow." Snake took a step closer, towering over Nicholas. The stench of alcohol wafted from him, and his voice dropped mockingly. "And what if we don't want to, Mr. Thompson?" He said the name like it was a joke. "What's an old-timer like you gonna do about it?" "I've already called the police 3 times, Nicholas replied calmly. "They're on their way." Snake's expression darkened. With a furious motion, he hurled his beer bottle to the ground, shattering glass near Nicholas's feet. "You called the cops on us?" Snake said, turning to his friends. "Looks like Grandpa here needs a lesson in respect." 2 bikers moved toward Nicholas's property, one kicking over his mailbox, while the other began uprooting his beloved rose bushes. Nicholas's heart pounded as he watched the destruction of the garden he had painstakingly cared for over the years. "Stop this immediately!" His voice boomed across the street, surprising even himself with its force. "You're breaking the law." Snake's laugh was devoid of humor. Without a word, he stalked over to the flagpole and yanked on it with all his might. The metal pole creaked under the strain, swaying dangerously. "Don't touch that flag," Nicholas warned, his voice low and menacing. In his mind, he was no longer standing on his front lawn. He was back on his ship in 1945, defending what mattered most. But Snake ignored him. With one powerful tug, the flagpole came crashing down, and the American flag, Nicholas's pride and joy, fell into the mud. In that moment, Nicholas moved faster than he had in years. Without thinking about his safety, he lunged forward, shoving Snake away from the fallen flag. The younger man stumbled back, caught off guard by the old veteran's strength. "You shouldn't have done that, old man," Snake growled, his anger flaring. He raised his fist, preparing to strike, but before he could swing, the wail of police sirens pierced the air in the distance. "This isn't over," Snake spat, backing away. "Not by a long shot." He gestured to his gang, and without another word, they retreated into the warehouse, leaving behind a trail of chaos. Minutes after, 2 police cars arrived. Officer Rodriguez, accompanied by Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew, helped Nicholas retrieve the flag from the mud. "Mr. Thompson, you'll need to file a report," the officer said, eyeing the ruined garden with a somber look. "But honestly, sir, these guys are dangerous. Maybe you should stay inside next time." Nicholas, his hands trembling with a mix of anger and sadness, carefully folded the flag. "Stay inside," he murmured to himself. "That's what people said about bullies back in 1941. Look what happened then." After the police left, Nicholas sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the devastation until the first light of dawn. His once beautiful roses were torn from the ground, his flagpole bent and broken, and his mailbox twisted on the lawn. But the worst part wasn't the destruction. It was the fear he had seen in Officer Rodriguez's eyes. As the sun rose, Nicholas reached for his old leather wallet, where behind his faded ID and a picture of Martha, he found a small, worn military card. He had kept it for over 70 years. Maybe now it was time to use it. These bikers had made a grave mistake. They thought they were dealing with a defenseless old man, but they were about to learn what true brotherhood meant. In the following days, Nicholas's once peaceful neighborhood was plagued by trouble unlike anything it had ever experienced. Snake and his red serpents were more than just angry, they were out for revenge. Their efforts to torment Nicholas and make his life miserable began with small acts of aggression. Every morning, Nicholas would find motorcycles parked across his driveway. When he called a towing company, the drivers would glance at the red serpent logo on the bikes and refuse to help. Even the local police, it seemed, had grown hesitant. They would slow down but not stop when passing the warehouse. On Monday morning, Nicholas was met with another sight that twisted his gut. His trash cans had been knocked over, their contents scattered across his yard. As he bent down to clean it up, each motion sending pain through his aching back, 3 bikers sat across the street, laughing and pointing. "Need some help, Grandpa?" one of them mocked. "Maybe you should hire a gardener if you can afford one." Nicholas ignored them, silently continuing to clean the mess. Jenny's father, Mark, had offered to help, but when he saw Snake watching from the warehouse, he waved him off. "No need to put other families at risk," Mark said. By Wednesday, things had escalated. The bikers started a cruel game they called Ring Around Nicholas. They would circle his house on their motorcycles, revving their engines as loudly as possible. The noise was deafening, so much so that Nicholas's cat, Mr. Whiskers, ran away and hadn't returned. Mrs. Chun, who had tried to bring Nicholas some homemade dumplings, was stopped by 2 bikers. "Sorry, lady," they sneered. "This sidewalk's closed for business." With tears in her eyes, she hurried away, leaving the dumplings behind. That night, Nicholas sat alone in his kitchen, eating soup from a can. His daughter Sarah had called earlier, worried about him after hearing about the trouble from the neighbors. "Dad, please come stay with us. Just until things calm down," she had begged. But Nicholas had refused. "This is my home," he told her firmly. "I didn't let the Japanese push me off my ship in '44, and I'm not letting these punks push me out of my house in 2024. The next morning brought the worst sight yet. Nicholas awoke to find his entire lawn covered in motorcycle tracks. The bikers had spent the night doing donuts on his grass, leaving a trail of destruction. His beloved roses, the ones he and Martha had planted together all those years ago, were completely ruined. Even the neighbors, who once waved to Nicholas as they passed by, now crossed the street to avoid walking past his house. It wasn't because they didn't like him. It was because they were afraid. Snake and his gang had made it clear. Anyone who helped Nicholas would feel their wrath. That afternoon, Officer Rodriguez drove by again. "Mr. Thompson," he said softly from his car window, "I'm sorry, but there's not much we can do unless they physically hurt someone. Maybe it's time to think about moving." Nicholas stood on his porch, surveying his ruined yard. The flagpole was still broken, the garden destroyed, and now black tire marks scarred his once perfect lawn. But deep inside him, that same fighting spirit that had carried him through the war refused to break. That evening, Snake came by to deliver his final message. He rode up to Nicholas's front porch on his motorcycle, his gang following closely behind. The biker leader pulled out a spray can and began painting a large red snake on Nicholas's garage door. Beneath it, he wrote a crude message: "No VTS LLOET." The other bikers cheered and high-fived, as though they had won some great victory. Victory. Snake turned to face Nicholas, who had been watching from his window. "This is your final warning, old man," Snake yelled. "Next time we might not be so kind." As the bikers revved their engines and roared away, Nicholas slowly walked back to his bedroom. From the bottom drawer of his dresser, he pulled out an old wooden box. Inside, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, was the military ID card he had been contemplating. It had been decades since he had needed this connection, but desperate times called for desperate measures. His gaze fell on the number written on the back of the card, and this time his hands were steady, solid as steel, as he picked up the phone. Sometimes he thought you had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, bikers with bikers. The Red Serpents thought they were tough, but they were about to find out what real toughness looked like. The morning light revealed the full extent of the Red Serpent's destruction. Nicholas stood in his driveway, his heart sinking as he took in the spray-painted garage door. The red snake seemed to mock him, its painted eyes staring back defiantly. The words, "No VTSLT," felt like an attack. Not just on him, but on everything he had fought for. Mrs. Rodriguez passed by in her car, but this time she didn't honk her usual greeting. Her young son pressed his face against the window, his wide eyes taking in the destruction. He waved sadly at Nicholas, but his mother quickly pulled him away. The street that had once echoed with children's laughter was now silent with fear. Nicholas began scrubbing the garage door with an old brush and soapy water, each movement protesting under the weight of his frustration. Suddenly, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. 3 Red Serpents pulled up, led by Snake's right-hand man, a biker known as Hammer. "Cleaning up our artwork, Ultimer?" Hammer jeered, revving his engine. Shame Snake spent so much time on that masterpiece. Nicholas kept scrubbing, trying his best to ignore them, but then Hammer did something that changed everything. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of fabric, the American flag. It was the same one the bikers had torn down days ago. Now it was stained with dirt and motor oil. Hammer sneered as he tossed the flag onto Nicholas's driveway, driving over it and leaving black tire marks across the stars and stripes. Something inside Nicholas snapped. In his mind, he saw the faces of the young men he had served with, men who had never come home. They had died protecting that flag. His hands began to shake, but not from age or fear. This time it was anger. "You know what?" Nicholas said quietly, placing the brush down. "I've been too patient." He walked slowly to his mailbox, which now leaned sideways from the biker's vandalism. Inside, he found the usual mail, including a letter from his daughter Sarah. But beneath it was something else. His old wallet, which he had placed there earlier that morning. The bikers watched, amused, as Nicholas opened the warm, worn leather wallet. Behind a faded picture of Martha was the military ID card he had kept all these years. The card wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was a connection to a brotherhood that never died. "What's that, Gramps? Your ARP card?" Hammer mocked, with the other bikers laughing. Nicholas ignored them, his fingers running over the edges of the card. The phone number on the back was faded, but still legible. He had memorized it decades ago, never thinking he would need to use it. But now, looking at his desecrated flag lying in the driveway, he knew it was time. Ignoring the insults shouted from behind him, Nicholas walked back into his house. For the first time in days, the words didn't bother him. He picked up the phone and dialed the number. His fingers moved with purpose. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah," the voice said. "This is Nicholas Thompson," he replied clearly. "Navy, Pacific Theater, 1943 to 1945. Service number 7-49-21-21. There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Hold on, sailor." After a moment, a new voice came on the line, older, full of authority. "Nicholas Thompson, from the USA Arizona Rescue Operation?" the voice asked. "Yes, sir," Nicholas responded. "I know it's been a long time, but—" "Say no more, brother," the voice interrupted. "We take care of our own. Always have, always will. What's your location?" As Nicholas gave his address, he heard the sound of motorcycles roaring in the background on the other end of the line. Different bikes than the Red Serpents. The voice on the other end of the line was different this time. Clear, purposeful, and powerful. "Stay put, Nicholas," it said. "Help is on the way. A lot of it." After hanging up, Nicholas returned to his front window, where Hammer and his gang were still loitering, making noise and stirring up trouble. They thought their snake patches and tough guy attitudes made them intimidating, but Nicholas allowed himself a small smile. Soon they would learn the true meaning of brotherhood. Soon they would understand the difference between pretending to be tough and being truly strong. As he looked at the tattered flag in his driveway, Nicholas was reminded of something his old commander had told him in 1945. Sometimes the best fights are the ones where you don't throw a single punch. You just show up with better friends. 2 hours after his phone call, the first sign of change shook the quiet suburban street. It started as a distant rumble, unlike the harsh sound of the Red Serpent bikes. This noise was deeper, more organized, almost like the approach of a marching army. While Snake and his gang continued their usual morning revelry outside the warehouse, they, too, heard it. The sound grew louder, coming from both ends of the street. Snake stood up from his lawn chair, his face shifting from confusion to concern. Nicholas watched from his window as the first motorcycles appeared. These weren't just any bikes. They were gleaming Harley-Davidsons, their chrome shining in the morning sun. The riders wore leather vests too, but these were adorned with American flags, military patches, and unit insignias. The bikers came in waves, first 5, then 10, then 20. Soon, both ends of the street were filled with motorcycles. The riders moved with military precision. Nicholas counted at least 50 veteran bikes, all forming a perfect circle around the Red Serpent's warehouse. The new bikers didn't rev their engines unnecessarily or shout. They simply formed their circle and waited. Their discipline was unmistakable. These weren't just troublemakers playing tough. These were men and women who had proven their strength on real battlefields. A large motorcycle pulled up in front of Nicholas's house, and the rider, a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair tied back in a tight braid, dismounted. On her vest were combat medals and a patch identifying her as Iron Lady, a Desert Storm veteran. She walked up to Nicholas's door and knocked firmly. When he opened it, she gave a crisp salute. Senior Master Sergeant Sarah Martinez, Sir, U.S. Air Force, retired, she said. We heard one of our brothers needed some help. Behind her, more veterans were dismounting their bikes. They came from different eras: Vietnam veterans with gray hair, Gulf War veterans in their 50s, and younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Some walked with canes, others with prosthetic limbs, but all of them moved with purpose. That's quite a response to one phone call, Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. Iron Lady smiled. That number you called, it reached the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. We have chapters in all 50 states. When we heard it was Nicholas Thompson, the Nicholas Thompson who saved 3 men from the burning Arizona. Well, sir, people started riding in from 3 states away. Snake and his gang, standing outside their warehouse, had been trying to look tough, but now they were visibly nervous as more veterans arrived. To the Red Serpents, they may have appeared intimidating to civilians, but now, surrounded by real warriors, they seemed small. A large man with a Marine Corps tattoo carefully picked up Nicholas's desecrated flag from the driveway, his hands shaking with anger. With military precision, he folded it before 2 other veterans quickly produced a new flag from one of their bikes. Permission to raise the colors, sir? The Marine asked Nicholas. Nicholas nodded, his eyes brimming with tears, as the new flag was hoisted onto the repaired flagpole. More than 50 veterans snapped to attention and saluted. Even some of the neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, placed their hands over their hearts. Iron Lady turned to face the Red Serpents. Her voice rang out across the street, calm yet full of authority. We need to have a conversation about respect, particularly for our World War II veterans. Snake, trying to maintain his tough guy persona, sneered, "This is our territory now. You can't just—" A veteran interrupted him, his voice booming like thunder despite his age. The man was probably in his 70s, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime of experience. Son, the only territory here was paid for with the blood of men like Nicholas Thompson. Men who fought and died for the flag you just desecrated. More veterans began to walk toward the warehouse, their steps synchronized like a well-drilled unit. They didn't need to make threats or act aggressively. Their presence alone was enough. Nicholas stood on his porch, silently watching as Iron Lady approached, her combat boots clicking against the pavement. The contrast between her, a woman who had fought in real battles, and Snake, a bully who only pretended to be tough, was striking. Iron Lady's voice cut through the stillness of the street as she spoke with clarity and authority. Let's talk about how things are going to change around here. Snake and his gang, now surrounded by real veterans, looked less confident than before. They were about to learn a crucial lesson. There's a big difference between pretending to be tough and truly being strong. True strength, as Nicholas had learned long ago, wasn't about intimidation. It was about brotherhood, honor, and standing up for what was right. Iron Lady stood tall in the middle of Cedar Street, her boots firmly planted on the asphalt. Snake and his red serpents huddled near the warehouse, their tough guy facade now visibly cracking. The morning sun reflected off the many military medals and patches decorating the veterans' vests. First things first, Iron Lady announced, her voice full of the commanding presence of someone accustomed to leading troops. We're going to clean up every bit of vandalism you've done to Mr. Thompson's property. Every tire track, every piece of garbage, every splatter of paint. Snake puffed up his chest in a last attempt to regain some control, but an older veteran, wearing a Vietnam service medal, stepped forward and interrupted. And if we don't? He asked with a calm but firm tone. We'll make some calls, he said coolly. See, we've got brothers and sisters in every police department, every courthouse, and every city office in this state. One phone call about the building code violations in this warehouse. He let the threat hang in the air, his meaning clear. Another veteran, this one walking with a prosthetic leg from the Iraq War, pulled out his phone. Funny thing, he said, my sister works at the DMV. She'd be real interested in these illegal modifications to your bikes. The red serpents began to shift uncomfortably. Their tough guy image was rapidly disintegrating as they realized they were facing people with real power, not just the ability to intimidate elderly neighbors. You can't prove anything, Hammer said, but his voice faltered. Iron Lady smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. Actually, we can, she said, pulling out some papers. Mr. Thompson installed military-grade security cameras last week. Clear as day, even at night. Everything you've done is recorded. Snake's face turned pale as he realized his mistake. He hadn't noticed the tiny cameras. But here's the real kicker, Iron Lady continued. While you boys were busy terrorizing an American hero, we did a little research. She paused dramatically, her eyes locking onto Snake. Snake, or should I say Robert Wilson, you've got 3 outstanding warrants in 2 states. The red serpents exchanged uneasy glances. They'd always been told that Snake was wanted by the law because he was too tough to be caught. Now they were discovering the truth he had been hiding. Hammer's got some paperwork issues too, another veteran added. And that warehouse you're squatting in? The owner's a Marine Corps veteran. He's very interested in what you've done to his property. The red serpents began to retreat, their tough guy act unraveling as they realized everything was falling apart. Snake's carefully crafted image as a hard-edged leader was collapsing, and his real identity was now laid bare. Iron Lady raised her voice, her words cutting through the tension. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to clean up every bit of damage you've done. You're going to apologize to Mr. Thompson and to everyone else you've harassed. Then you're going to leave this neighborhood and never come back. Snake, in a last-ditch effort to sound threatening, growled, and if we refuse? A deep voice from behind him answered, then we stay. It was the Marine veteran who had folded Nicholas's old flag. We'll camp out here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every time you try to sleep, we'll do motorcycle maintenance. Every time you try to party. He let the words hang in the air, a silent promise of unyielding presence. We've got enough members to keep this going for years, the veteran leader said, his voice steady and unwavering. Nicholas watched from his porch as Snake's resistance finally crumbled. The leader of the gang looked around at his crew, who were already beginning to step away from him. With a muttered curse, Snake relented. Fine, he grumbled, we'll clean it up. Iron Lady, undeterred, gave the orders. Start with the flag paint on Mr. Thompson's garage, she commanded. And while you work, some of us will share stories about what real toughness looks like. like the time Mr. Thompson here swam through burning oil to save his shipmates at Pearl Harbor. For the next few hours, the red serpents worked under the watchful eyes of the veterans. Snake and Hammer scrubbed the graffiti off Nicholas's garage, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Other gang members fixed up the garden, replaced the damaged mailbox, and cleaned up the mess they'd made. Nicholas, sitting in his favorite porch chair, was surrounded by veteran bikers. They shared their service stories, each one offering a reminder to everyone within earshot of what true courage, brotherhood, and respect meant. By late afternoon, 2 police cars arrived. Officer Rodriguez stepped out, accompanied by deputies from neighboring counties. Robert Wilson, one of the officers, called out, "You're under arrest for those outstanding warrants." Snake, his tough guy persona utterly shattered, was led away in handcuffs. Iron Lady turned to Nicholas with a satisfied smile. "Mission accomplished, sir." Nicholas surveyed the scene. His property was cleaned up, the flag flying proudly above it, and the bullies who had terrorized the neighborhood were being taken away. "Mission accomplished," he agreed. "But please stay for dinner. Martha taught me how to make a mean pot roast." As news of Snake's arrest spread through the neighborhood, Cedar Street felt lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. Nicholas sat in his living room, surrounded by veterans who were sipping coffee and exchanging stories about their service years. Iron Lady had organized teams of veteran bikers to help restore the neighborhood. Some worked on fixing up Nicholas's garden, replanting roses, and removing all traces of motorcycle tracks from his lawn. Others cleaned up the mess left behind at the warehouse by the red serpents. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Rodriguez said as he stepped into the living room, a notebook in hand, "we found some interesting things in that warehouse. Looks like Snake and his gang were involved in more than just making noise. There's evidence of stolen motorcycle parts, illegal weapons, and drugs." The remaining red serpents, those who didn't have criminal records, had scattered quickly after Snake's arrest. Most of them were just misguided young people who had followed a bad leader. Without Snake, they had lost their drive to cause trouble. "What's going to happen to the warehouse?" Nicholas asked, watching through the window as veterans cleaned the graffiti from its walls. Iron Lady smiled and pulled out some papers from her leather jacket. "That's the best part, sir. The owner of the warehouse, a Marine Corps veteran I mentioned earlier, wants to donate it to our Veterans Motorcycle Alliance. We're thinking of turning it into a community center." The other veterans nodded in agreement, excited by the idea. One of them, a former Army engineer, was already sketching plans for the new space on a napkin. "We could have a meeting area for veterans, a workshop for teaching motorcycle maintenance to kids, maybe even a small museum about local military history." Just then, Mrs. Chan appeared at the door, carrying a large tray of dumplings. This time, no one stopped her as she made her way inside. "These are for everyone," she said with a smile. "Thank you all for bringing peace back to our street." More neighbors began to gather, bringing cold drinks for the veterans working outside. The street, once filled with tension, had transformed into a place of unity and healing. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with several trays of homemade tacos, and even Nicholas's cat, Mr. Whiskers, finally came back home, purring loudly as he rubbed against the tough biker's legs. "You know what this street really needs?" Iron Lady remarked, surveying the gathering community. "A proper flag ceremony every morning. Mr. Thompson shouldn't have to raise the colors alone." The veterans immediately agreed. They decided to establish a new daily tradition. Every morning at 7 a.m., any veterans in the area would join Nicholas to raise the flag. It would serve as a reminder of what the flag truly represented. Not just military service, but community, respect, and unity against fear. As evening neared, Nicholas's daughter, Sarah, arrived, her face full of concern after hearing about the excitement in the neighborhood. She found her father surrounded by his new friends, sharing his famous pot roast recipe with veterans who treated him like a beloved commander. "Dad!" Sarah exclaimed, hugging him tightly. "Are you okay? I was so worried when I heard about the arrest and everything." Nicholas gently patted her hand. "Never better, sweetheart," he replied. "Just reminded of something I learned back in 45. Sometimes the best family isn't the one you're born into, but the one you find along the way. Outside, the veterans had strung up lights across the street, turning the cleanup effort into an impromptu block party. Children, who had been hiding inside for days, now came out to play, fascinated by the shiny motorcycles. The veterans were more than happy to show them how the bikes worked. Officer Rodriguez returned with even more good news. The warehouse has been officially cleared by the police. And get this. The city council held an emergency meeting and fast-tracked the permits to turn it into a veterans community center. The street, which had once been filled with tension and fear, was now alive with celebration. The sound of laughter, music, and the smell of good food filled the air. Neighbors and veterans mingled, exchanging stories and discussing plans for the community center. As night fell, Nicholas stood on his porch, looking at his restored property. His garden was replanted, his flag was flying proudly, and his neighborhood felt like home again. But more than that, Center Street had found something it had never had before. A real sense of protection. Not from fear and intimidation, but from people who understood the true meaning of strength and service. Iron Lady joined him on the porch. You know, sir, this is just the beginning. Wait until you see what we have planned for this community. Nicholas smiled, watching as veterans taught neighborhood kids how to properly fold an American flag. I can't wait to see it, he said, but first, I think we need more pot roast. I've got a lot of new family members to feed. 6 months had passed since Nicholas's life-changing phone call, and Center Street had transformed into something special. The old warehouse, once a symbol of fear, now stood proudly as the Veterans Community Center, its walls adorned with military flags and a fresh coat of navy blue paint. Every morning at 7 a.m., Nicholas would step out onto his porch for the flag-raising ceremony. He was never alone. On average, 15 to 20 veterans would join him each day, their motorcycles neatly parked along the street. Some days, the group was even larger, especially when Iron Lady led one of her popular veterans' breakfast meetings. The center had become the heart of the neighborhood. Local kids came after school for free motorcycle maintenance classes taught by veterans. Mrs. Chun had started a weekly cooking class, where she taught military families her secret dumpling recipe. Even Jenny had her own corner in the building, helping veterans learn how to use computers and smartphones. This morning was especially special. Nicholas stood in his garden, now more beautiful than ever. The veterans had not only restored his roses but had also added new varieties, including a special white rose bush they named Martha's Memory in honor of his late wife. Ready for the big day, Mr. Thompson? Iron Lady called out, walking up his driveway in her formal veteran's attire, her medals glinting in the morning sun. Today was the first annual Center Street Veterans Festival, and the entire neighborhood had spent weeks preparing for it. The streets were decorated with American flags, and the smell of barbecue filled the air as Mrs. Rodriguez and her family prepared their famous tacos in the center's new kitchen. Born ready, Nicholas replied, using Iron Lady's real name. After 6 months of coffee and shared stories, they'd become close friends. The festival wasn't just a celebration. It was a statement about how one person's courage could change an entire community. People came from all over the state. Veterans, families, and even some former Red Serpents who had turned their lives around after Snake's arrest. Nicholas's daughter, Sarah, arrived early, carrying a large photo album. Inside were pictures showing the transformation of Center Street, from the days of the Red Serpents to the present. The last photo, taken just yesterday, showed Nicholas surrounded by smiling children as he taught them about proper flag etiquette. "Dad," Sarah said, hugging him tight, "I can't believe how different everything is now. Remember when I wanted you to move away?" Nicholas chuckled. "Sometimes running away isn't the answer. Sometimes you need to stand your ground and dial the right number." By noon, the festival was in full swing. Veterans from 5 states had ridden in on their motorcycles, creating an impressive display in front of the center. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to sergeant, brought his entire police department for the free barbecue. Even the mayor showed up, presenting Nicholas with a key to the city for his role in transforming the neighborhood. But the biggest surprise came when Iron Lady called everyone's attention to the center's main wall. For the first time, a large mural was unveiled. It depicted a young Nicholas in his Navy uniform, standing proud on the deck of his ship. Below the image were the words, Nicholas Thompson Community Center. Where courage meets community. We wanted to rename it, Iron Lady explained to a tearful Nicholas, because this place, this whole change in the neighborhood, it all started with you. One brave man who refused to be bullied, who remembered that true strength isn't about intimidation, but about bringing people together. As Nicholas looked around at his transformed neighborhood, he saw something that would have seemed impossible just 6 months ago. Children played safely in the streets while veterans taught them about respect and honor. Neighbors chatted with each other, no longer hiding behind closed doors. The sound of motorcycles was no longer threatening. It was the sound of friends arriving to share stories and help others. Mr. Whiskers, now the unofficial mascot of the Veterans Center, rubbed against Nicholas's legs as he stood, taking it all in. The old veteran reached down to pet his cat, his eyes misting over as he thought about Martha and how proud she would be. You know what, old friend, he whispered to Mr. Whiskers. Sometimes the best battles aren't won with fists or weapons, but with a phone call to the right people at the right time. And as the festival continued around him, Nicholas Thompson, the 93-year-old veteran who had changed everything, sat in his favorite porch chair surrounded by his new family. Proof that courage, honor, and brotherhood never go out of style.